In this video, we'll look at skin tones, how we can evaluate them, and how we can adjust them. So I've got a couple reference prints here. Here's 1 and 2. So let's take a look at the different samplers on each one of the model's faces. So starting with sampler number 1, when I go look at the info panel, I don't want to see the magenta value, so the 23. The magenta value should not be higher than yellow. If it is, we're looking at somebody who's sunburned, or there's some sort of makeup or something going on that's not a naturally occurring skin tone. So in this case, the yellow value is 8 percentage points higher. In other words, if I take the yellow value, 31 minus 23, I have a difference of 8. Usually we don't see a difference of more than 10 to 12 would be the upper limit. In Caucasian skin tones, it usually doesn't get that high. In Hispanic, Asian, South Asian skin tones, First Nation skin tones, we can see the yellow values certainly get towards the upper end of that range. Now the cyan value, we have to do a little bit of math here. In this case, we're looking at somebody who's Asian. I would expect the cyan value to be in around 1/3 to 1/4 of magenta. Now, if math isn't your forte, no worries. What we can do in order to figure that out, we'll take 23, right? That's the value that I'm reading from the magenta, divided by 4. So it's almost 6. So 1/4 of 23 is basically 6. 1/3 of 23, 23 divided by 3, is almost 8. So if our cyan value reads between 6 and 8, which it does, right? It reads 7, then we're in the ballpark for how much cyan should be in that skin tone. Let's move to the next person, have a look at her skin tone. You can see her skin is darker, therefore the numbers will be higher. We expect that. I'm not looking for specific numbers. I'm looking for relationships. So if I take 43 minus 35, that's a difference of 8. So it's a little bit on the higher side, a little more yellowish skin tone than what we'd see typically with somebody who is Caucasian. However, this is perfectly fine. So it's not the absolute numbers, it's the difference. For 35%, to figure out the value for cyan, I would take 35 divided by 3. So 1/3 of 35 is roughly 12. 1/4 of 35, so 35 divided by 4, is roughly 9. So if my cyan value is between 9 and 12, we're doing pretty good. It's a touch high, not a big deal, 1 percentage point. So let's move on to the model on the left. We have a little bit different skin tone going on, and we can see the yellow isn't that much higher than magenta. And that's typical of what we'd see with a Caucasian skin tone. The cyan, the cyan is almost 10, or is reading 10. It's almost half of the magenta. The cyan is getting quite high. If I could get it down to even 1/3, so 22, the reading of magenta, divided by 3. If I could get the cyan value down to around 7, her skin would look a little richer and not quite so pasty. So that might not be a bad thing. Pull some of the cyan out using hue saturation. Finally, last model on the end here on the left, that's the readout for her skin tone. For someone who's black, I don't have any rules whatsoever for cyan. That can vary all over the place. But for magenta and yellow, again, magenta should never be higher. And in this case, the yellow actually is 11 points higher. And that's fine. We've said anywhere in that 10 to 12 or maybe 13 points higher. That's about the maximum. I'm going to switch up to this image. The image is a bit on the bright side, which is why the cyan is reading 0. But I really want to just concentrate on the magenta and yellow. They're fairly closely matched. Well, they are matched, so they're quite close. But still, the magenta is not going higher. We're probably about at the limit. You can see just with these different images up on screen, this fellow here is starting to look rather magenta. However, still within range. So that image that you did on the curves assignment, if I put a threshold adjustment layer on the image, oops, that's hue saturation, threshold adjustment layer, I can see that the sky gets identified as the brightest part, but there's no detail back there. It's out of focus, there's nothing going on there, so I would go a little brighter yet, and I can see I could put a highlight on her shoulder. So let's do that. Down in the shadow, so that's going to be in her hair. Maybe I'll move that down just a tiny bit. Now, when I go to curves, so I add a curves adjustment layer. If you have not watched the video on using curves to color correct an image, it's in the week 3 notes, and I really encourage you to watch it because I'm going to use the eyedroppers here in curves to make this a little faster. Highlight eyedropper, click, that's set. Shadow, click, that's set. Midtone, I'm going to try here in her shoulder in that shadowy part and call it done. So I'm pretty happy with how this image looks. I basically have my 10 and 245 range. Now I'm going to add another sampler on her skin to get a reading. Now there's a bit of sheen on her cheek here that I probably want to avoid. However, I also don't want to get into the shadow area on her face. So maybe a reading down in around here, that might give us a good sense. Oops. Let's put a color sampler there. That'll give us a good sense of the skin tone. Make sure when you're trying to read out in the info panel to get CMYK, click and hold, choose CMYK. Then, when you look at the numbers here, we can see that the yellow is 15 points higher than the magenta. That's getting pretty high. And given that it's around sunset, the light's fairly warm, our model looks like, she's got a pretty good tan being on the beach. So 15 is pushing it. Let's figure out what cyan would be acceptable. So on the low end here, so 34 divided by 3, that's about 11. 34 divided by 5, because remember, a Caucasian skin tone could be a third to a fifth for cyan. It's a reading of 7. So in around 7 to 11, and that's what I'm seeing here in the cyan. It's right in that range. So I'm going to add a hue saturation adjustment layer, and I'm going to pick a color, and then go grab the eyedropper from hue saturation and go click on our model. Now, if I move the hue slider towards magenta, so to the left, that will lower the yellow value. And there's about 10 points higher, and that's looking a little bit more realistic. Not quite so yellowish a skin tone. Last shot here, if I take a look at the sampler and I read those numbers, I can see that the magenta is 8 points higher than the yellow. It's at 48 instead of 40. This is not acceptable. Right now he's looking too pink, too magenta. So let's grab hue saturation, pick a color, grab the eyedropper, click on his face, and then if I want to see whether his face is being changed or not, let's take the hue slider and crank it all the way up. And I can see not only is his face changing, but also we've got a lot of stuff in the background too. That's okay. We'll mask that out in just a minute. So if I look at these sliders here, right, and the vertical bars define the range that gets the full adjustment. the little tabs on the outside edge here, this range here and this range of color here is being represented as the area where the effect of our color change will be feathered off down to nothing. The area between the two vertical bars gets 100% of the change. Now with the hue slider, forget what you see here. This is decoration. If I move the hue slider to the left, the color that's on the left of our range is magenta. If I move the hue slider to the left, he'll get more magenta. If I move it to the right, that's where I find yellow. And if you forget how that works, just grab the hue slider, right, and move it to the left, and you go, oh, he's getting more pink. That's not good. Let's go to the right. That's getting a bit better. And for this particular person, I find even if the magenta and the yellow are matched or very close to it, that's perfectly fine. That gives us a skin tone that looks quite natural. Now to hide that change from the back, right, from the background of the image, we're on the layer mask, so that's active. I press down Control and Option, and then I will click and hold. Here's our brush. Click and hold with the brush and drag to the side. And I'm going to soften up the edge of that brush a little bit. Let's just move the opacity to 100% for the brush and take a look again. So that's probably a bit soft, something like that will work. And then what I do is paint with black on my layer mask, because then that will hide the adjustment from the background of the image. So I do a quick swipe and around him. And now we can see just his face is changing. So I hope you found this useful, having a look at a few different skin tones, how to adjust them and how to evaluate them.